September 16, 2022. One death in police custody triggered the largest challenge to Iran's ruling system in decades. Within 120 days, protests spread across more than 160 cities. The footage looked familiar. Burning streets, riot police, university arrests, internet blackouts. But the real panic inside Tehran was not the demonstrations themselves. Iran's leadership had survived unrest before. In 1999, 2009, and 2019, what frightened them this time was something far more dangerous. Some of the men ordered to suppress the unrest no longer believed the system could survive long term. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, was built after 1979 to prevent exactly this scenario. An internal security force parallel to the army, better funded, better armed, politically vetted. Roughly 190,000 personnel across ground forces, missile units, naval divisions, intelligence branches, and the Basij mobilization networks. But authoritarian systems rarely collapse because protesters become stronger. They collapse because enforcers become uncertain. Iran appeared externally aggressive, expanding missile programs, funding regional proxies, seizing tankers in the Gulf. But internally, years of sanctions, inflation, and elite corruption were degrading the loyalty structure underneath the regime itself. For a 45-year-old investor in London or Chicago, this is not theoretical. Roughly 20% of global oil consumption passes through the Strait of Hormuz. Any instability involving Iran affects insurance premiums, shipping routes, inflation forecasts, retirement portfolios, and energy prices within days. Analysts at multiple Western strategic assessment institutions concluded that Iran's greatest vulnerability was no longer military invasion, it was institutional exhaustion. The protests were visible, but the erosion inside the security structure was happening somewhere almost nobody was looking. Iran's economy did not collapse in one dramatic moment. It decayed in layers, because US sanctions after the withdrawal from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2018 cut Iran off from much of the global financial system. Oil exports dropped sharply from pre-sanctions levels exceeding 2.5 million barrels per day. But the state continued funding military operations, regional proxy networks, and ballistic missile programs. So ordinary households absorbed the pressure instead. Inflation surged beyond 40% during multiple periods. The Iranian rial lost enormous value against the dollar in parallel market trading. Middle-class savings evaporated, but the deeper danger was not public anger. It was institutional corruption inside the enforcement apparatus itself. IRGC-linked companies had expanded into ports, construction, telecom infrastructure, shipping, and energy logistics over decades. The organization became not only a military structure, but a financial empire. And empires create winners and losers internally. Lower-ranking personnel faced collapsing purchasing power while politically connected elites moved wealth abroad. Reports emerged of affluent families linked to senior insiders purchasing property in Turkey, the UAE, and Malaysia, because the state prioritized strategic endurance over domestic prosperity. Electricity shortages and industrial disruptions intensified even while missile production continued. But that contradiction became visible to ordinary Iranians serving inside the system. And once enforcement personnel begin comparing sacrifice against elite privilege, ideological cohesion starts weakening. In 1989, the Soviet Union still possessed thousands of nuclear warheads when miners began striking over unpaid wages. 2 years later, the state ceased to exist. Powerful systems rarely fail from the outside first. They fail when the people maintaining them stop believing sacrifice is temporary. The first serious warning signs did not emerge in Tehran at all. The earliest indicators of fragmentation appeared in the provinces, not in the presidential offices.
Not in televised speeches. In logistics, because authoritarian systems depend on reliable movement of fuel, communications equipment, payroll transfers, riot control supplies, and personnel rotations. Disruptions inside those networks matter more than slogans in city squares. During periods of unrest, reports surfaced of delayed deployments, inconsistent response times, and localized refusal patterns among lower-tier Basij elements. Not open rebellion. Something quieter. Hesitation. Iran's security doctrine was shaped heavily by the Iran-Iraq War between 1980 and 1988. The lesson embedded into the regime's DNA was simple: decentralized survival capacity. That meant overlapping intelligence bodies, parallel chains of command, and compartmentalized authority structures. But compartmentalization creates another problem. Central leadership receives slower and less reliable information during crises, because regional commanders often filtered local realities before passing them upward. Tehran risked operating on politically sanitized intelligence, so crackdowns became harsher.
Arrests became broader, executions increased, and every escalation solved the immediate unrest while deepening long-term resentment inside the same population the regime depended on for manpower. One logistics detail especially alarmed outside analysts. Commercial satellite monitoring and shipping assessments indicated unusual fuel redistribution patterns near internal security hubs during major protest periods. That suggested contingency planning for prolonged domestic instability, rather than temporary unrest. The demonstrations were becoming manageable. The fear inside the system was not. Authoritarian governments reveal panic differently from democracies, not through speeches, through movement. Because when senior insiders begin preparing private escape routes, capital preservation becomes more important than ideological confidence. There were increasing reports over several years of families connected to elite networks relocating assets abroad. Foreign residency applications quietly increased among wealthy Iranian circles. Private education transfers accelerated. None of this proves imminent collapse. Elite hedging happens in many states. But timing matters. Because these shifts intensified while the regime publicly projected absolute confidence. And authoritarian systems survive partly through perception management. The image of inevitability is itself a strategic asset. The Islamic Republic has historically relied on a doctrine combining religious legitimacy, coercive enforcement, and resistance nationalism. Especially after Operation Praying Mantis in 1988, when the United States destroyed major Iranian naval assets in a single day. Tehran learned survival required asymmetric resilience rather than conventional dominance. So the regime built redundancy everywhere. Missile silos buried underground, distributed proxy networks, parallel intelligence structures. But redundancy is expensive.
And expensive systems become vulnerable when economic decline lasts too long. One estimate from energy analysts suggested Iran loses billions annually from underinvestment and infrastructure inefficiency in its oil and gas sector alone. A state sitting on some of the world's largest hydrocarbon reserves was struggling with rolling blackouts. That contradiction told insiders something terrifying about the future trajectory of the system. The outside world had already started preparing for instability scenarios long before most viewers noticed the crisis. Global energy markets react to probability, not certainty, because traders do not wait for governments to collapse before pricing risk. Even rumors of instability around the Strait of Hormuz affect shipping calculations immediately. Lloyd's market insurers, Gulf energy planners, and maritime security analysts all monitor Iranian internal stability closely. For one reason, nearly one-fifth of globally traded petroleum liquids transit through nearby waterways. But the real concern was never just oil disruption. It was command fragmentation. Iran possesses one of the Middle East's largest ballistic missile inventories. It maintains relationships with armed non-state actors across Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. It operates cyber capabilities developed partly in response to operations like Stuxnet. So external actors faced a strategic dilemma. Pressure Iran too hard, and nationalist cohesion could strengthen the regime internally. Ease pressure too much, and the regime regains financial breathing room. This problem has historical precedent. In 1978, the Shah of Iran appeared militarily dominant months before his government collapsed. In 1991, Soviet hardliners still controlled vast arsenals shortly before institutional disintegration accelerated uncontrollably. States can look powerful right before they become unstable. A single closure threat in the Strait of Hormuz has previously moved oil markets within hours. Not because traders believed Iran would permanently block the passage, because even temporary disruption calculations can move billions of dollars before the first ship changes course. The worst-case scenario for global powers was never Iran staying strong. It was Iran becoming weak too quickly. The final contradiction is the most uncomfortable one. The same institutions accused of repression are also preventing something potentially worse: uncontrolled fragmentation inside one of the most strategically important states on Earth.